The battlefield was silent now. Only the distant crackling of fire and the soft hum of a dying power core remained. The once mighty fleet of the Siluri Empire had been shattered, betrayed by those they called allies. Smoke and debris drifted through space as escape pods burned up in the planet's atmosphere below. Princess Kivera had barely escaped. Her escape pod, damaged in the attack, had spiraled out of control before crashing onto an unknown world. Now she lay on the hard ground, her body aching, her vision blurred. The blue sky above her felt too bright, too open. She was used to the metal halls of a starship, not the endless stretch of wilderness surrounding her. Kivera gritted her teeth and pushed herself up. Pain shot through her side. Her armored suit was torn, and dark green blood oozed from a deep wound near her ribs. She pressed a hand against it, breathing heavily. She had to move. She had to find shelter. If the traitors were hunting her, they would track her signal soon. Staggering forward, she took in her surroundings. The planet was strange. Lush green trees, towering rock formations, and rivers that shimmered under the twin suns. It was unlike any place she had ever seen. But beauty meant nothing if it couldn't keep her alive. She activated her wrist communicator. Static. No response. The traitors must have jammed the signal. Kivera clenched her fists. How had this happened? The Xelari were the strongest empire in this sector. The Velker, their supposed allies, had turned on them, wiping out the royal fleet in one swift strike. She had watched as her father's flagship exploded, taking her family with it. She had sworn to fight, to avenge them. But what could she do alone on a primitive world? Her vision blurred again. She was losing too much blood. She needed to rest. A cave in the distance caught her eye. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Dragging herself forward, she stumbled with every step. She didn't know how long she walked before she collapsed inside the cave, her strength finally failing. For the first time in her life, Princess Kivera, heir to the Xelari throne, felt truly alone. A stranger with kindness. Darian Holt wiped the sweat from his brow as he loaded the last of the mineral samples onto his hover cart. Another long day of prospecting. Life on this backwater planet wasn't easy, but it was peaceful. After years of war, he had chosen this quiet existence, far away from the conflicts of the galaxy. He picked up his scanner and checked the readings. Something was off. A strange energy signature had appeared not far from his camp. It wasn't there yesterday. Darian frowned. A crash drone. A malfunctioning beacon. Whatever it was, he should check it out. If it was salvageable, he might find something useful. Climbing onto his speeder bike, he followed the signal into the wilderness. The deeper he went, the stronger the readings became. His instincts told him something wasn't right. Years of military experience had trained him to recognize danger. And right now, his gut was telling him he wasn't alone. Then he saw the tracks, uneven footprints, leading toward the cave up ahead. Whoever made them was injured. Darian slowed his bike and reached for his sidearm, just in case. Stepping inside the cave, he found her. A woman. No, not human. Alien. Her skin had a faint purple hue. Her armor was torn, and she was bleeding badly. Despite her wounds, she had an air of royalty about her, as if she wasn't used to being vulnerable. Darian sighed. He could walk away. He didn't owe her anything, but he had seen too many people left behind in battle, too many soldiers abandoned to die. He wasn't that kind of man. He knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hey," he said gently. "You're not dead yet. Let's keep it that way." Her golden eyes flickered open, filled with confusion and defiance. She tried to push him away, but her strength was gone. "Stay back," she rasped. Darian chuckled. "Not much of a welcome, but lucky for you, I don't scare easy." He pulled out his medkit and started treating her wound. Kivera could barely keep her eyes open, but she felt the warmth of his hands, the careful way he worked. It was strange. She had been raised to believe humans were primitive, weak, untrustworthy. And yet, Here was one, saving her life. As darkness took her, one thought remained in her mind. Why would a human help an enemy? Kivera woke to the sharp scent of something burning. Her body ached, her head felt heavy, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the memories hit her, the betrayal, the escape, the crash. She had collapsed inside a cave, wounded and alone, but she was no longer alone. She turned her head slightly and saw him, a human. He sat near a small fire, tending to a metal pot filled with steaming liquid. His back was turned, but she could see his broad shoulders, the way he moved with practiced efficiency. His clothes were simple, worn from years of use, and a weapon rested within reach. Kivera tried to push herself up, but a sharp pain shot through her side. She gasped, and immediately the human turned around. His eyes met hers, calm, steady, and assessing. "You're awake," he said, setting aside what he was doing. "Took you long enough." Kivera narrowed her eyes. "Where am I?" Her voice was weak, and she hated it. The human leaned back against the cave wall. "About 20 miles from where you crashed. I found you half dead and bleeding all over the place. You're lucky I got to you first." She clenched her jaw. The idea of being saved by a human made her stomach turn. The Exilary Empire saw humans as a lesser species, resourceful but primitive, clever but lacking discipline. And yet, this one had patched her up instead of leaving her to die. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharper than before. He raised an eyebrow. "Why what? Why did you help me?" The human sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because you were bleeding out. Because I don't like watching people die when I can do something about it. Simple as that." Kivera stared at him. His answer made no sense. In her world, everything was done for a reason. Alliances, betrayals, wars. But this man had no reason to help her. She glanced down at her body. Her armor had been removed, replaced with a rough but secure bandage around her ribs. The wound had been cleaned. He had taken care of her. She hated that she owed him for it. A difficult recovery. Darian watched as the alien princess struggled to sit up. She was proud. He could see it in her golden eyes, in the way she refused to show weakness. He had seen that same look in soldiers before. "You shouldn't be moving yet," he said, standing up. Kivera ignored him, gritting her teeth as she forced herself upright. "I don't take orders from a human." Darian smirked. "And yet here you are, sitting in my cave, patched up by my hands." She glared at him but said nothing. He chuckled and walked over to the fire, grabbing a bowl of hot broth. He handed it to her. "Eat," he said. Kivera hesitated. The food smelled strange, but she was starving. Swallowing her pride, she took the bowl and sipped cautiously. It was warm, salty, and filled her empty stomach. Darian sat down across from her, watching as she ate. "So," he said, "are you gonna tell me what Exilary Princess is doing on a backwater planet like this?" Kivera stiffened. "How do you know who I am?" He shrugged. "I fought in the war against the Exilary a few years back. I've seen your kind before. And I know a royal when I see one." She lowered her bowl slightly. "You were a soldier. Used to be." His tone was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, something tired. "Now I'm just a prospector, looking for minerals and staying out of trouble." Kivera studied him. He had the look of a warrior, but he carried himself like someone who had walked away from battle. That puzzled her. In the Exilary Empire, warriors fought until they died. They didn't simply leave. She looked away. "I was betrayed. My people, my entire fleet, were wiped out by those I thought were allies." Her grip tightened on the bowl. "I am the last of my line." Darian let out a slow breath. "That's rough." She frowned. "That's all you have to say?" "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "That I understand. That I know how it feels to lose everything. Because I do. But words won't change what happened." Kivera blinked, surprised by his honesty. For a moment, They sat in silence, two warriors from different worlds, bound by loss. A dangerous world. Darian stood up. You need rest. Your body's still weak. I need to leave, Kivera said, trying to move. You won't get far in your condition, he replied. And you don't even know where you are. She hated that he was right. Where am I? Planet Novus 4. Unclaimed, wild, and crawling with things that'll eat you if you're not careful. Kivera's eyes narrowed. Then why are you here? Darian smirked. Because I can handle myself. Kivera exhaled slowly. She didn't like this. She didn't like feeling helpless, relying on a human. But until she regained her strength, she had no choice. Darian picked up his rifle. I'm heading out to check my traps. You stay put. Kivera crossed her arms. I don't take orders from humans. Darian grinned. Yeah, you said that already. Then he walked out, leaving her alone with her thoughts. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Kivera realized something troubling. This human, this simple prospector, wasn't afraid of her. And that made him dangerous. Kivera sat near the fire, staring at the flickering flames. The warmth of the cave did little to comfort her. Her body was healing, but her mind was restless. She was a Xilari princess, heir to the greatest empire in the galaxy. And yet here she was, wounded, stranded, and dependent on a human. The thought made her stomach turn. She forced herself to stand, gritting her teeth against the pain. Her ribs ached, but she had suffered worse before. She needed to regain her strength. She needed to leave. Taking a slow breath, she scanned the cave. It was simple. Rough stone walls, a pile of supplies in the corner, and a bedroll near the fire. The human, Darian, had left earlier, saying he needed to check his traps. She had expected him to give her orders, to act as if she owed him for saving her. But instead, he had simply told her to rest and walked away. It made no sense. Kivera clenched her fists. Humans were supposed to be selfish. They were supposed to demand payment for their help. But this one, he didn't ask for anything. That made him dangerous. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move. She needed to see how much strength she had left. She stepped toward the cave entrance, pushing aside her pain. The fresh air hit her face as she stepped outside. The landscape stretched before her, rolling hills, jagged cliffs, and a dense forest in the distance. The twin suns were high in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. It was a strange world, untamed and wild. She had to get off this planet. Kivera reached for her wrist communicator and activated it. Static. She cursed under her breath. The signal was still blocked. A rustling sound caught her attention. Her muscles tensed as she turned toward the noise. Something was moving in the bushes nearby. Her hand went to her side, but she had no weapon. Then, the creature stepped into view. It was large, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, black fur. Its yellow eyes locked onto hers, and its sharp claws dug into the ground. Kivera recognized it instantly. A Vornax beast, one of the most dangerous predators in this sector. Her heart pounded. She was weak, unarmed, and alone. The beast let out a low growl, stepping closer. Kivera knew it was testing her, deciding if she was prey. She refused to die like this. Straightening her posture, she met the creature's gaze. A Xilari never showed fear. Even in death, she would not bow. The Vornax tensed, muscles coiling. Then, a sharp whistle cut through the air. A gunshot followed. The creature roared in pain as a blast of energy struck its shoulder. It spun around, searching for its attacker. Darian stood on a nearby ridge, rifle in hand, his expression calm. The Vornax hesitated. It was wounded now, and like all predators, it knew when a fight wasn't worth it. Snarling, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Kivera exhaled slowly. Darian lowered his rifle and walked toward her. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But next time, maybe don't pick a fight with something twice your size." She scowled. "I didn't pick a fight." Didn't run either, he pointed out. Kivera crossed her arms. A Xelari warrior does not flee. Darian smirked. Well, that's one way to get yourself killed. She glared at him, but he wasn't wrong. She had been helpless just now, and she hated it. He nodded toward the cave. Come on, you're still recovering. She wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her. The brief confrontation had drained what little strength she had left. Without another word, she turned and walked back into the cave. A lesson in survival. Darian placed his rifle against the cave wall and sat down near the fire. You're lucky that thing backed off, he said. Vornax don't usually run from a fight. Kivera lowered herself onto the bedroll. It wasn't fear. It recognized a stronger predator. Darian raised an eyebrow. Me or you? She hesitated, then sighed. You. The admission burned her pride, but she couldn't deny the truth. Darian chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. Kivera watched as he pulled a knife from his belt and began sharpening it. You know this planet well. Been here a few years, he replied. Plenty of things out here want to kill you. You learn fast, or you don't last long. She studied him. His movements were precise, his eyes always scanning the surroundings. He had the instincts of a warrior, but he didn't act like one. You were a soldier, she said. Darian's hand paused for a moment before continuing. Yeah. What happened? He glanced at her. I walked away. Kivera frowned. Warriors don't just walk away. Darian met her gaze. Humans do. She didn't understand. A Xelari warrior fought until the end. To leave the battlefield was to abandon one's duty. But humans, they were different. And for the first time, she wondered if that difference was why they survived. An unlikely alliance. Kivera looked down at her hands. She hated feeling weak, but she wasn't foolish. She needed to regain her strength, and this human knew how to survive. She exhaled. Teach me. Darian raised an eyebrow. Teach you what? She met his gaze. How to survive on this planet. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but it won't be easy. She smirked. I don't need easy. Darian grinned. Good. Then we start tomorrow. As the fire crackled between them, an unspoken understanding passed between warrior and soldier, princess and outcast. For now, their fates were tied together. And Kivera knew this human might be the key to taking back everything she had lost. The first rays of the twin suns stretched across the rugged terrain, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Kivera stood outside the cave, feeling the crisp morning air against her skin. Her body still ached from her injuries, but she pushed the pain aside. She had given her word. She would learn how to survive on this planet. Darian stood a few feet away, inspecting his rifle. His movements were steady, practiced. He glanced at her and smirked. You sure you're up for this? Kivera lifted her chin. A Xelari never backs down from a challenge. Darian chuckled. All right then, princess. Let's see what you can do. The first lesson. Tracking and hunting. Darian led her through the dense forest, moving with quiet precision. Kivera followed, studying the way he stepped carefully, avoiding dry leaves and twigs. He barely made a sound. Lesson 1, he said in a low voice. Survival isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing your surroundings. Kivera frowned. I was trained in combat, not sneaking through the wilderness. Darian grinned. That's why you have me. She crossed her arms but said nothing. He knelt and pointed at the ground. See this. She looked down and saw faint imprints in the soil, claw marks, deep and spaced apart. Vornax tracks, Darian explained. This one passed through here last night. Judging by the size, it's the same one from yesterday. Kivera studied the marks. So you track the creature to hunt it. Darian shook his head. Not always. Sometimes. It's better to avoid a fight. Kivera stiffened. A Xelari does not run from a battle. Darian sighed. Let me guess. In your empire, strength means never showing weakness. She nodded. A warrior must always be ready to fight. Darian stood up and met her gaze. Then your empire is wasting soldiers. Kivera narrowed her eyes. Excuse me. He crossed his arms. Strength isn't just about swinging a sword or firing a gun. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. He gestured to the forest around them. Out here, you fight only when you have to. You pick your battles. Otherwise, you don't live long. Kivera hesitated. His words made sense, but they went against everything she had been taught. Darian turned and continued walking. Come on, we've got more to cover. She followed, but her mind was restless. The second lesson, using the land. After an hour of walking, Darian stopped near a stream. The water was clear, flowing gently over smooth stones. He knelt and cupped some in his hands, taking a drink. Kivera hesitated. How do you know it's safe? Darian smirked. Experience. The water moves fast enough to keep it clean. If it were still, I'd boil it first. Kivera knelt beside him and took a sip. It was refreshing, easing the dryness in her throat. Darian pointed at a cluster of green leaves nearby. That plant there. Good for treating wounds. But that one. He gestured to a similar-looking plant a few feet away. Is toxic. Mix them up, and you won't live long enough to regret it. Kivera examined both plants carefully. They looked almost identical, but one had slightly darker veins on its leaves. Your empire teaches you how to fight, Darian said, but did they ever teach you how to survive? Kivera didn't answer. She had spent years training in combat, studying war strategies, learning how to command fleets. But survival, that was left to the lower ranks. Someone of her status had no need to hunt for food or identify plants. And yet, here she was, learning from a human who had no title, no army, and no empire. It frustrated her, but it also intrigued her. The third lesson. Facing fear. The suns had climbed higher by the time they returned to the cave. Kivera's muscles burned, her wounds ached, but she refused to show weakness. Darian sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. He glanced at her. You did all right today. She scoffed. I don't need your approval. He grinned. Didn't say you did. She watched as he worked, his hands steady and sure. Despite his relaxed demeanor, she could see it. The sharpness in his eyes, the readiness in his posture. He was always prepared. You were a soldier, she said suddenly. Darian nodded. Yeah. Why did you leave? He paused, his fingers tightening around the weapon. Then he set it down and leaned back. Because war takes everything from you. Even if you survive, you don't walk away whole. Kivera frowned. You're saying you regret fighting. Darian exhaled. No, I fought because I had to. But when the war was over, I realized something. No one wins in the end. You just survive. Kivera looked away. She had lost everything. Her fleet, her people, her future. And yet, she was still here. Just surviving. For the first time, she wondered if that was enough. A new path forward. As the fire crackled, Darian spoke again. Tomorrow, we start weapons training. Kivera raised an eyebrow. You think I need training? Darian smirked. I think you need practice. Out here, it's not just about skill. It's about instinct. She crossed her arms. I will prove myself. Darian chuckled. You already are, princess. She didn't argue this time. Because deep down, she knew, this human, this lone survivor, was teaching her more than just survival. He was teaching her how to live. And for the first time in her life, Kivera wasn't just preparing for war. She was preparing for something greater. The sun had barely risen when Darian handed Kivera a weapon. It was an old plasma pistol, slightly worn but still functional. She turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight. It was different from the sleek, high-powered weapons of the Scifi Empire, but a gun was a gun. Darian smirked. Think you can handle it, princess? Kivara scoffed. I was trained in over a dozen forms of combat. This is nothing. Darian nodded toward a row of makeshift targets, wooden logs and metal scraps set up near the edge of the cave. All right then, let's see it. She took her stance, aimed, and fired. The plasma bolt struck the target, but it was slightly off-center. She frowned and adjusted her grip, firing again. The second shot was better, but still not perfect. Darian chuckled. Not bad, but you're too stiff. Kivara shot him a glare. I hit the target, didn't I? He stepped beside her. Sure, but out here, hitting the target isn't enough. You need to hit fast, accurate, and under pressure. She straightened. Then teach me. Darian nodded. All right, let's make it interesting. A warrior's instinct. Darian placed small metal discs on the ground and pressed a button on his wrist device. The discs activated, floating into the air. A second later, they shot off in different directions. Kivara barely had time to react. She lifted the pistol and fired, missing the first target entirely. The second one zipped past her, and she fired again, this time hitting the edge. Darian whistled. Come on, I thought you were trained in combat. Kivara gritted her teeth. Again. The discs reset, and this time, she was ready. She focused, her sharp eyes tracking their movement. The moment they shot into the air, she fired, hitting the first one dead center. The second and third followed, both struck before they could escape. Kivara lowered the gun, breathing heavily but satisfied. Darian grinned. Not bad, princess. She smirked. I told you. But Darian's expression grew serious. All right, next lesson. A real enemy won't wait for you to take your shot, so let's see how you handle a fight. Kivara's eyes gleamed. Finally, a real challenge. Clash of strength. Darian tossed her a combat knife. She caught it with ease, testing its balance. It wasn't as elegant as a Xilari blade, but it would do. Darian took his own stance, knife in hand. Rules are simple. You disarm me, you win. I disarm. I win. Kivara smirked. You won't disarm me. Darian shrugged. Let's see. In a flash, Kivara lunged. She moved with the speed and precision of a trained warrior, her blade slicing toward his side. But Darian was fast. He sidestepped and deflected her strike with his forearm, using her momentum against her. She twisted, adjusting her stance, and struck again. This time, their blades met in a clash of steel. Darian pushed forward, forcing her back, but Kivara countered with a swift kick. He barely dodged, rolling away before she could press her attack. Darian grinned. You're quick. Kivara twirled the knife in her hand. You're holding back. His smile faded. All right then. No holding back. He moved fast, faster than she expected. Before she could react, he closed the distance, locking their blades together. He used his weight to force her back, but she shifted her stance, using his own force against him. For a moment, they were locked in a dance of speed and strength, neither gaining the upper hand. Then Darian made a mistake. He went for a high strike, exposing his side. Kivara saw the opening and took it. With a swift move, she knocked his knife away and pressed her blade against his throat. Darian froze. Then he grinned. Well, I'll be damned. Kivara smirked. Told you. He stepped back, rubbing his wrist where she had twisted it. You're good. Really good. She lowered the knife. I was trained to be the best. Darian studied her for a moment. Yeah, but that's not all, is it? She frowned. What do you mean? Darian sat on a nearby rock. You fight like someone who has something to prove. Kivara hesitated. He wasn't wrong. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for her honor, for the empire that had abandoned her, for the future that had been stolen from her. She clenched her fists. I will not be weak. Darian sighed. Kivara, strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing what you're fighting for. She looked away. For so long, she had believed that strength meant never showing weakness, never backing down. But Darian, he had survived in this brutal world by being more than just a fighter. He was smart, resourceful, and adaptable. And she was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, there was more to survival than just war. An unspoken bond. As the sun began to set, Darian tossed her a small ration pack. Eat, you'll need your strength. Kivera caught it and sat beside him by the fire. Tomorrow, we train again. Darian smirked. You bet. She nodded, but this time, she wasn't just preparing for another lesson. She was preparing for something bigger. Because out here, on this wild and untamed planet, she wasn't just learning how to survive. She was learning how to be something more. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and burning wood as the fire crackled between them. Night had fallen, and the twin moons cast a soft glow over the rugged terrain. Kivera sat across from Darian, sharpening the blade he had given her. Each stroke of the stone against the metal was steady, precise. Darian leaned back against a rock, watching her with a small smirk. You really don't take breaks, do you? Kivera didn't look up. A warrior must always be ready. Darian chuckled. You sound like a training manual. She finally glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. And yet, I disarmed you today. He grinned. Fair point. For a moment, silence settled between them. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers, nor the tense quiet of enemies. It was something else, something unfamiliar yet not unwelcome. But then, Darian's expression shifted. His relaxed posture stiffened, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their camp. Kivera noticed immediately. What is it? Darian held up a hand for silence. He listened, his sharp instincts picking up something just beyond the trees. A sound, low, almost like a growl, followed by the rustling of leaves. He reached for his rifle. We're not alone. The hunter becomes the hunted. Kivera was already on her feet, gripping her blade tightly. She knew Darian well enough by now. He wasn't the type to get nervous over nothing. If he was on edge, then something was wrong. Then she saw it. Glowing yellow eyes flickered between the trees, watching them. The creature was large, its muscular frame barely visible in the shadows. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing them. Darian exhaled. Vornax. Kivera tensed. She had seen the tracks before, had heard Darian's warnings about this beast. But seeing it in person was different. It was massive, easily twice the size of a human, covered in thick, dark fur with sharp claws that gleamed under the moonlight. Darian whispered, "Don't make any sudden moves." Kivera nodded, but the moment she shifted her foot, the creature reacted. With a guttural snarl, it lunged. A fight for survival. Darian rolled out of the way as the Vornax's claws swiped inches from his chest. Kivera darted in the opposite direction, dodging its powerful tail as it swung wildly. The beast was fast, too fast. Darian raised his rifle and fired, but the plasma bolts barely slowed it down. The Vornax roared in anger, charging at him with terrifying speed. Kivera didn't hesitate. She leaped forward, slashing at its side with her blade. The creature howled in pain, spinning toward her with fury in its glowing eyes. Darian cursed. Great, now it's mad. Kivera smirked. At least it knows we're not weak. The Vornax swiped at her, but she ducked, rolling to the side. Darian used the distraction to fire again, this time aiming for its legs. A shot landed, making the beast stagger. But it wasn't enough. With one powerful lunge, the Vornax slammed its body into Darian, sending him crashing into a tree. Darian, Kivera shouted. He groaned but didn't move. Kivera's heart pounded. For the first time, fear crept into her mind, not for herself, but for him. The Vornax turned its attention back to her. It snarled, ready to strike. But Kivera wasn't afraid anymore. With a fierce battle cry, she charged. The warrior's instinct. Time slowed. Every movement, every breath became crystal clear. She had trained for battles like this. She had been bred for war. The Vornax lunged, but she was ready. She sidestepped at the last second, slashing her blade across its exposed throat. The creature roared in agony, staggering back, but Kivera didn't stop. She drove the knife deeper, twisting it with precise force. With a final, pained snarl, the Vornax collapsed. Its massive body hit the ground with a heavy thud. Kivera stood over it, breathing hard, her blade dripping with its blood. She had won. But she didn't feel victorious. She turned to Darian, rushing to his side. He was conscious, but blood dripped from a wound on his forehead. He groaned. "Remind me never to fight one of those again." Kivera smirked, offering him a hand. "You wouldn't have survived without me." He took it, letting her pull him up. Yeah, you saved my life. I get it." She tilted her head. "You're welcome." Darian chuckled, wincing as he touched his wound. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Kivera shrugged. "A little." He sighed. "All right, fine. You win this round, princess." She glanced at the fallen Vornax, then back at him. "We both did." A new understanding. They sat by the fire again, their bodies sore, their breaths still heavy from the fight. But there was something different now. A silent understanding. Darian broke the silence. "Back on your homeworld. You were a warrior, right?" Kivera nodded. "One of the best." He studied her, and now. She hesitated. She had always believed her purpose was to fight, to prove her strength. But here, in this wild land, she was learning that strength wasn't just about battles. It was about survival, about trust, about knowing when to fight, and when to stand beside someone instead of standing alone. "I'm still a warrior," she said finally. "But maybe there's more to it than just war." Darian smiled. "Yeah, maybe there is." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. For the first time in a long time, Kivera didn't feel like she had to prove anything. For the first time, she wasn't just a warrior. She was something more. And that, she realized, was a battle worth fighting. The night air was still, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. Kivera sat with her blade in hand, slowly wiping away the dried blood of the Vornax. The fight had been brutal, but they had survived. That was all that mattered. Darian sat across from her, pressing a cloth against the wound on his forehead. He winced slightly, but there was a small grin on his face. "Not bad, princess," he said. "You handled that beast like a real hunter." Kivera smirked. "And you handled getting thrown into a tree like a true survivor." Darian chuckled. "Yeah, well, I try." For a moment, they simply sat in silence. The battle was over, but an uneasy feeling lingered in the air. The planet was still dangerous. Their journey was far from finished. Then, Kivera spoke. "We need to move soon." Darian nodded. "Agreed. The fight probably attracted unwanted attention, and if there are more Vornax out there, I'd rather not stick around to find out." Kivera looked toward the distant mountains. "We keep heading west. You said there might be a settlement." Darian exhaled. "Yeah, a trading outpost. If it's still there, we might find supplies. Maybe even a way off this planet." Kivera was quiet for a moment. A way off this planet. That was what she had wanted all along, wasn't it? To return to the stars. To return to her empire. But now, the thought of leaving felt different. She looked at Darian. "And what will you do?" He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "When we find a way off this planet, where will you go?" Darian hesitated, staring into the fire. "I don't know." Kivera tilted her head. "You must have a home somewhere." Darian let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Not really. I was a soldier once. Fought in wars I didn't believe in. When it was over, I didn't have anywhere to go. Just drifted from place to place, taking whatever jobs I could find. Kivera frowned. She had always assumed Darian was just another human mercenary, one of those who only fought for money or survival. But now she saw something else. A man without a home, without a purpose. Strangely, she understood that feeling all too well. She took a deep breath. Then maybe it's time you find one. Darian looked at her, surprised. And where do you suggest I start? Kivera met his gaze. With me. A warrior's choice. Darian was silent for a long time. He studied Kivera carefully, as if trying to understand what she really meant. Finally, he sighed. You planning to go back to your empire? Kivera hesitated. A part of her still wanted to. She had spent her whole life training to serve the Xilari Empire, to prove her worth as a warrior. But another part of her, the part that had fought beside Darian, had survived on this harsh planet, had learned what it meant to be more than just a soldier, wasn't so sure anymore. My people abandoned me, she said quietly, left me to die. Darian nodded. Yeah. And yet, you still talk about them like you owe them something. Kivera clenched her fists. Did she? Did she really owe anything to an empire that had cast her aside the moment she became an inconvenience? She had always believed that loyalty was strength, but now she was beginning to see that strength came in different forms. Maybe it was time to choose her own path. She looked at Darian. I don't know where I belong anymore, but I do know this. I don't want to walk this path alone. Darian smirked. Well, lucky for you, I make good company. She rolled her eyes. Debatable. He laughed. All right, princess. If you're asking me to stick around, I guess I don't have anywhere better to be. Kivera allowed herself a small smile. Good. A new beginning. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, they packed up their supplies. The planet was still wild and dangerous, but they had survived this long. Kivera strapped her blade to her waist, glancing at Darian as he slung his rifle over his shoulder. So, he said, stretching. What now? Kivera looked toward the distant horizon. We keep moving. We find that outpost. And then, we decide what comes next. Darian grinned. Sounds like a plan. They set off together, side by side. For the first time in her life, Kivera wasn't following orders. She wasn't proving herself to an empire that had abandoned her. She was choosing her own path. And for the first time, she wasn't walking it alone.